Hi everybody, welcome back to English 112. This is for our class for Thursday, the 5th of May, where we are talking about poetry. At this point, our paper number 2 on drama would have been submitted. And then what we are doing is putting some closure onto the poetry unit so that you've got a journal due at the ending of Tuesday, which is our very last class, talking about poetry. And then, of course, there is the final examination. And for the final, we are basically devoting it to poetry, where I'm going to select a handful of poems and ask you to choose two and to explicate or analyze those particular poems. And you can use your notes. It's open book, open notes. And basically, what I'm thinking is that you will compile everything that we've talked about in terms of that poem, but you would expand and elaborate because we really are going rather quickly, believe it or not, because we could spend an entire semester just on one poem, but I wanted to give you an overview of some of the different kinds of poetry that exist. So we began the poetry unit by talking about sonnets, a very traditional form of poetry, and then we moved and we talked about metaphysical poetry, which was another form of poetry writing during a comparable time period, but it had very different techniques associated with it. It was meant to basically a surprise and to upset expectations. And then we also talked about Anne Bradstreet's The Author to Her Book that female would have been writing during this time period as well. And then we move forward to some of the other poems. And you'll remember that I had given you a poem entitled American Poetry that broke out of the chronology that I had established, because after we talked about the author to her book, we talked about the Romantic period and what that style was like. And that meant that we talked about William Blake. And then, of course, we talked about Emily Dickinson and her style of writing. But American poetry really anticipated that what we would find with both American poetry and, I argued, more contemporary poetry is a much raw style. And I think you'll definitely see that in Next to, of course, God, America, I, which is what I had assigned for today, as well as America. And while we did read The Road Not Taken after American poetry, in many ways it was quite traditional. But when you read Next to, of course, God, America, I, and this happens to be on page 718 of your text, but you can see below that there's also a link. You can see that E. E. Cummings is known for breaking conventions. And E. E. Cummings would oftentimes break conventions through capitalization. But unlike Emily Dickinson, who would oftentimes capitalize words that shouldn't be capitalized, at least according to grammatical conventions, E. E. Cummings does the opposite and uses lowercase for words that oftentimes or always would be capitalized, proper nouns. Words like America, for instance, or God. And by not giving that capitalization, then they're not giving, or E. E. Cummings is not giving that word the sense of authority and respect that usually is associated with it. So it undercuts that. And you'll see that in this particular speech, it's going to be a questioning of standard patriotism. And keep in mind that this poem was written in 1926. So definitely the idea of patriotism was much more strict than it is today. And this poem is also going to establish a setting of the context of where it's taking place. And I wanted to read this poem to you, and I think it illustrates the importance of reading it carefully because the poem begins actually with a quotation mark. And that quotation mark does not end until almost the ending of the poem. So the bulk of this poem is basically a quote. And it reads, Next to, of course, God, America, I love you, land of the pilgrims, and so forth. Oh, say, can you see, by the dawn's early, my country 'tis of centuries come and go, and are no more of it. What we should worry in every language, even deaf and dumb. Thy sons acclaim your glorious name, by gory, by jingle, by gee, by gosh, by gum. Why talk of beauty? What could be more beautiful than these heroic happy dead, who rush like lions to the roaring slaughter? They did not stop to think, they died instead. Then shall the voice of liberty be mute? And this is where we get our closing quote. And then there's a break, and then the poem ends. He spoke and drank rapidly a glass of water. So the idea that he's speaking and drinking a glass of water suggests that the setting is someone giving a public speech. And in the setting of giving a public speech, one assumes as well that the speech would be very much reinforcing the ideas associated with patriotism rather than undercutting them, which is what we've got in this particular poem. That we've got fragments of things like the national anthem and the Pledge of Allegiance, and that oftentimes these are elements that are associated with patriotism. And what E. Cummings is suggesting is that that is not an element associated with patriotism just because one can recite a pledge or sing a song. And because we are only getting snippets, the suggestion is that we may not even know all the words. And as we go on, next, of course, God, America, I love you, land of the pilgrims, and so forth, or say, can you see? In other words, yeah, 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 yeah. What we find out is that in every language, even deaf and dumb are run together. These two words are breaking the conventions, and one might say that he too is breaking the convention of how one views America. And the suggestion is that we should pay attention to deaf and dumb because it is written incorrectly, at least the way that we would write it if we were writing in an essay. The idea is that Americans are deaf and dumb, and specifically the sons of America. When he says, thy sons acclaim your glorious name. The idea is that the sons of America in 1926 would be soldiers. So he's becoming critical of the military, which is also another institution that's associated with patriotism. That thy sons acclaim your glorious name by gory, by jingo, by gee, by gosh, by gum. Notice all these G sounds, the alliteration, the initial repetition of consonant sounds. And when you say them all very quickly, it almost sounds like the shooting that you might hear with a gun. And then we hear, why talk of beauty? What could be more beautiful? So notice how beautiful, again, is cut up into two different words. So the thing that's beautiful in the poem has also been destroyed. Then these heroic happy dead, and basically talking about soldiers being in effect. Heroic happy dead because they rushed like lions to the roaring slaughter, and they did not stop to think. And notice that when I give the pauses and the punctuation in the poem, it becomes so much easier to understand. But when we don't have the pause and the punctuation, then we have to struggle a little bit more to understand. And the idea is that individuals have joined the military and have even sacrificed their lives in the name of their country and in the name of liberty and patriotism, but that really wasn't patriotism at all. And when the question is asked, then shall the voice of liberty be mute? The question is, how ultimately does one show patriotism? Is it by blindly following, or at least what E. Cummings suggests, blindly following one's country and its policies, or is it by questioning one's country and being critical of one's country, which is what we see in this particular poem? And obviously, we can see in this poem that it is very, very different than what we would expect. We're even told at the bottom of the poem that this verbal debauch of chauvinistic cliches, notice the run-on phrases and lines, reveals that the speaker's relationship to God and country is not, as he claims, one of love. His public address suggests a hearty mindlessness that leads to roaring slaughter rather than to reverence or patriotism. Cummings allows the reader to see through the speaker's words to their dangerous emptiness. And one of the things we can say is that this poem likely evoked very strong reaction. In fact, it could evoke strong reaction even now in 2022. And the idea isn't that you agree with the author. The idea is that you understand the author's perspective, and then you can make a decision whether you agree with his criticism of America or whether you disagree and that you say that he's the one who's unpatriotic by being so critical of the United States and those elements of the United States that are associated with patriotism and patriotic duty. But as bold as this poem was, probably the boldest example that I can think of, which is also about America, happens to be by a beat poet. And this is a kind of writing that was very popular during the 1950s, mostly out of California. It was a movement, Berkeley in particular. And the beat poets in the 1950s wrote very defiant, unconventional poetry. They oftentimes would use a stream of consciousness approach, so it's supposed to mimic thought patterns. And of course, thought patterns don't necessarily follow any particular structures with grammar or mechanics, and oftentimes don't necessarily have clear connections between them or even make sense. And it's deliberately unclear. And you will also see many topical references, which can make reading the poetry difficult, because at the time, those references to the news and to newsworthy events would have made perfect sense to an audience in the 1950s, but obviously it wouldn't make that kind of sense to us today, so we'd probably have to look up those historical events. And you can see that in the notes below, I have included a link to this because it was not included in our textbook and the version or in the edition that I had ordered. And I also wanted you, because I know that I can't do this poem justice, I wanted you to listen to Allen Ginsberg himself, the author, do a reading of this poem. This reading is quite interesting, and you can see that in the link below. I'm directing you to a reading on YouTube. This was when he was presenting the poem in its draft form to an audience at Berkeley, California. And he taught at UC Berkeley. So he was basically talking amongst his own when he was presenting this draft. And you'll see if you're reading along with the text of the poem that the text is quite different than the initial draft in some respects, but the tone is most certainly the same. And I wanted you to listen to Ginsberg read, not just so that you could get a sense of his reading of the poem, but the audience's reaction. So this would be a good time for you to stop the video. It is 11:50. And hello, here we are back again at 11:50 or 11:50-ish. I hope that you have watched the Ginsberg video. And I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the elements within the poem. Notice the questioning that occurs in the poem as he's basically quite confrontational, asking, is this true? When he says, America, I've given you all, I've given you everything, and now I'm nothing. I have nothing left. America, $2.27, January 17, 1956. We assume the date is in reference to when the poem was written. We're not exactly sure what the monetary sum could be in reference to. It could be to the amount of money in his pocket or his bank account, or what he thinks America is worth, or what America thinks he's worth. I can't stay in my own mind. There definitely is an element of sanity and insanity. And who is insane? Is it him, or is it America, or is it both? Allen Ginsberg himself was known for being in and out of mental institutions, so there is an element of biography to this. When will we end the human war? That war is not about countries or politics. It's ultimately about humans. Go fuck yourself with your atom bombs. So you can see this use of profanity, and Ginsberg has oftentimes been criticized for being very self-indulgent and profane. Others have lauded him for being a poet of truth and realism, finally showing the ugly underbelly and utilizing the ugliness of language to illustrate that ugly underbelly. I don't feel good, don't bother me. I won't write my poem till I'm in my right mind. But of course, the poem has been written, so does that suggest he's in his right mind? America, when will you be angelic? And when will you take off your clothes? In other words, when will you show the truth? When will you look at yourself through the grave? In other words, when will America take responsibility for all of the lives that it lost through its own efforts or its own actions? When will you be worthy? When or why are your libraries full of tears? Because libraries show the truth. This is where we get the real history. Again, the ugly underbelly. When will you send your eggs to India? When will we be able to share our abundance in America with others? I'm sick of your insane demands. And again, we keep hearing this idea of sanity, insanity. When can I go to the supermarket and buy what I need with my good looks? The idea how we value appearance and celebrity, and oftentimes give privilege and access in our society to those individuals, even though they haven't earned it. America, after all, is you and I who are perfect, not the next world. The assumption is that Americans assume that they're right and everyone else is wrong, and that we do that ourselves. We truly believe that our opinion and our perspective is correct and somebody else's opinion and perspective is incorrect. Your machinery is too much for me. Lots of references to the mechanization of society, the idea that machines were taking away humanity and increasing workloads. The automation was removing the sense of individuality. Today we might have something comparable with computers. You made me want to be a saint. When we think about E.E. Cummings and about all of those elements that we are supposed to exhibit if we are patriots, there must be some other way to settle this argument. And again, there's this confrontational tone to it. And then he makes references to individuals such as Burroughs, who was another beat poet at the time. Are you being sinister? Or is this some form of a practical joke? Is this real America? And he says, I'm trying to come to the point, which is ironic because, of course, he's not. He's rambling. I refuse to give up my obsession. America, stop pushing. I know what I'm doing. I haven't read the newspapers for months, and every day somebody goes on trial for murder. So he's making references to things like the media and how the media doesn't necessarily report reality, and the media always or oftentimes reports the negative. And I feel sentimental about the Wobblies. This is a labor union. He oftentimes talks about labor and work, especially when he says, I used to be a communist when I was a kid, and I'm not sorry. Keep in mind, this was the height of the Cold War, or Russia and communism was seen as the enemy against capitalism. I smoke marijuana every chance I get. There are drug references in here, and he was very open about his drug use. At the time in which this poem was written, in the mid-1950s, marijuana was illegal, and it had been demonized. It still is somewhat demonized today, but certainly not to the extent it would have been in the 50s. I sit in my house for hours and stare at roses in the closet. Whether this is because he's high from the marijuana he's just smoked, whether or not he is looking at roses, perhaps rose wallpaper in the closet, whether or not, he's trying to make some sort of a symbolic statement that roses could never live in a closet because there is no light. When I go to Chinatown, I get drunk and never get laid. So there are all kinds of references to drinking, drug use, sexuality. My mind is made up. There's going to be trouble. And in some ways you could say that he is a prophetic writer, and many of these writers are, because I think many of the issues that he discusses are definitely issues in our contemporary society. And while previous poetry talked about timeless and universal themes, such as love, for instance, these poems are much more critical, and they're much more specific to our society constructions. And he says, you should have seen me reading Marx, Karl Marx, who wrote the Communist Manifesto. My psychoanalyst thinks I'm perfectly right. And the irony there, that one psychiatrist would think that one is sane. Again, the question, who is sane? Perhaps the insane people, or those that have been labeled insane, are really the sane ones. I won't say the Lord's Prayer. So this is somebody who's not going to fall into the idea of following organized religion either. I have mystical visions and cosmic vibrations, and that would be quite literal, again, because of the drug use. America, I still haven't told you what you did to Uncle Max after he came over from Russia. And again, the idea of what happens to soldiers, and what happens when we read something like Soldier's Home, and we saw how Krebs experienced injuries that were not just physical, but emotional. I'm addressing you. So this is the hard part of the poem, because at this point he's saying that the reader is America, so that means the reader is responsible. Are you going to let your emotional life be run by Time magazine? So this is the place in the poem where he becomes critical of the media. I can't even imagine what he would have thought of social media. I've oftentimes said that if we wanted to update this, we would substitute Time magazine with something like Twitter. I'm obsessed by Time magazine. I read it every week. Its cover stares at me every time I slink past the corner candy store. I read it in the basement of the Berkeley Public Library. And again, this would be quite literal because he was from Berkeley. It's always telling me about responsibility, that businessmen are serious and movie producers, everybody's serious but me. And again, you have to wonder, is that true? Perhaps he's the serious one and they're the ones that aren't serious, particularly when we reward business people to the point where they have such excess wealth that they don't necessarily even know how to spend it. Or movie producers that are given such access and privilege for basically fantasy. And much like sports players, and then individuals, much like, let's say, public servants who are perhaps even risking their lives, aren't given as much prestige or as much money. It occurs to me that I am America. So now he's taking a certain level of responsibility. Now, this poem has been criticized because of the fact that he is very critical and he doesn't offer solutions. But at least here he acknowledges that he himself might be part of the problem. I'm talking to myself again. Is anybody listening? That's really what he's asking. And then we've got a section about Asia, which would, again, be seen as a competitive superpower that could certainly become an economic superpower and displace America. And it's certainly a concern in today's world. Asia's rising against me and I haven't got a Chinaman's chance. So there is an expression about having a Chinaman's chance. So there is some humor here. I'd better consider my national resources. And then the poem actually falls apart. It doesn't even seem like a poem. It's more like a stream of consciousness. My national resources consist of 2 joints of marijuana, millions of genitals, and unpublishable private literature that jet planes 1,400 miles an hour and 25,000 mental institutions. And then he says, I say nothing about my prisons nor the millions of underprivileged who live in my flower pots under the light of 500 suns. And it seems to be suggestive that he's growing marijuana, and the sun lamps are the 500 suns. I've abolished the whorehouses of France, and Tangiers is the next to go, and my ambition is to be president, despite the fact that I'm Catholic. Keep in mind that we've only had 2 Catholic presidents in our history, one being Joe Biden, so that's in contemporary times, the other being John F. Kennedy. America, how can I write a holy litany in your silly mood? Again, is it that Ginsburg is being silly or that America is being silly and absurd? I will continue like Henry Ford. My strophes are as individual as his automobiles. More so, they're all different sexes. And Henry Ford was the creator of the Ford automobile and the assembly line and the idea that everything was exactly the same. So efficiency could be gathered through the assembly line structure. But there was, again, that loss of artistry and individuality. And a strophe is the movement of a Greek chorus when they all move and sing with the exact same movements. So you can see how Ginsburg's using a literary reference to talk about what's happening in the industrialized world. Free Tom Mooney and save the Spanish loyalists. Sacco and Vanzetti must not die. I am one of the Scottsboro boys. So these are direct references to elements within his society that he thinks show injustice. America, when I was 7, and notice how the poem falls apart again. America, when I was 7, Mama took me to a communist cell meeting. They sold us garbanzos, a handful per ticket. A ticket cost a nickel. The speeches were free. Everybody was angelic and sentimental about the workers. It was also sincere. You have no idea what a good thing the party was in 1835. And he goes on and says, everybody must have been a spy. And of course, the idea of paranoia and McCarthyism during the 1950s. America, you don't really want to go to war. And he's questioning, is this really what you want to do? You want to destroy rather than create? America's them bad Russians. And of course, in addition to Asia, Russia would be seen as the superpower enemy. Them Russians, then Chinamen, and them Russians. The Russia wants to eat us alive. The Russia's power mad. She wants to take our cars from out our garages. Notice how it's beginning to mimic some of the patterns of second language speakers, and also talking about the fear that communism will result in the loss of our hard-earned goods. Her wants to grab Chicago. She would have been the center of the auto industry. Her needs a read Reader's Digest, and Reader's Digest would have been a very popular media publication at the time. Her wants our auto plants in Siberia. Him big bureaucracy running our filling stations. That no good, Him make Indians learn read. Him need big black ends. Ha. Her make us all work 16 hours a day. Help. So notice the use of racial epithets as well. and the idea that the machinery and the mechanization that was supposed to simplify life and reduce workloads has only complicated it and increased workloads. America, this is quite serious. In other words, pay attention. This is the impression I get from looking at the television set. And television at the time was reaching its heyday, and this is where individuals were getting their view of the world. America, is this correct? And again, the question, prove me wrong. I'd better get right down to the job. It's true I don't want to join the army. He doesn't want to follow patriotic ideals that are propagated by the country, such as serving one's nation, or turn lathes in precision parts factories. He doesn't want to work in a poor-paying job that doesn't give him any sense of meaning. I'm nearsighted, psychopathic anyway. So he's nearsighted, he can't see, and he's psychopathic or insane. Or is it that he can see and we can't see? And we're the insane ones because we allow the system to flourish. And he's the sane one. America, I'm putting my queer shoulder to the wheel, and that would have been a very direct reference to his sexuality as well. He was openly homosexual in a time when one didn't talk about one's sexuality. So again, I've usually found some pretty strong opinions with Ginsberg. People either love him for his raw brutality, or people really hate him because they think he's being self-indulgent and offensive. Perhaps it's a little bit of the two. And then the last poem that I wanted to end with today, I hadn't assigned it necessarily for today, but I think I can squeeze it in. And then we can finish up with our poetry section next class, is entitled The Lover Not Taken. And this is on page 797 of your textbook. But again, I've also included a link if it turns out that you wanted to access it online. And I'm hopeful that the title sounds familiar to you, The Lover Not Taken, because it sounds very similar to a poem we've read previously, The Road Not Taken. And that's very deliberate because this is a parody of The Road Not Taken. So basically, The Lover Not Taken can be appreciated and enjoyed for its content, but it has an incredibly more rich sense of meaning if you understand that it's based on The Road Not Taken. And a parody is basically an exaggeration of something for humorous effect. Think of something like Saturday Night Live, if you will. So you need to be able to see enough of the original to know what's being parodied. But then again, it needs to be different enough so that it's something that is unique work. And The Road Not Taken, written in 1984 by Blanche Farley. Now keep this in mind. Robert Frost was male, and he wrote The Road Not Taken. Blanche Farley, female, and she wrote The Lover Not Taken. So we've got a difference with author. We also have a difference in terms of the choices that are made, because in The Road Not Taken, no specific choice is given. We're asked to supply that choice. The Lover Not Taken, the title tells us basically that we are going to be talking about a specific choice, a woman who's torn between two men. And the poem reads, committed to one, she wanted both, and mulling it over, long she stood alone on the road, loath to leave, wanting to hide in the undergrowth. This new guy, smooth as a yellow wood, really turned her on. She liked his hair, his smile. But the other, Jack, had a claim on her already, and she had to admit he did wear well. In fact, to be perfectly fair, he understood her. His long, lithe frame beside hers in the evening tenderly lay. Still, if this blonde guy dropped by some day, couldn't Way just lead on away? No, for if Way led on and Jack found out, she doubted if he would ever come back. Oh, she turned with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence, she might be telling this, and I, she would say, stood faithfully by. But by then, who would know the difference? With that in mind, she took the fast way home, the road by the pond, and phoned the blonde. And of course, if we were to go through this poem, we can see that it has a level of complexity that Frost's poem also has as well. And that she talks about her specific choice, and obviously there's language from The Road Not Taken so that we can recognize from this, such as undergrowth, this new guy, smooth as a yellow wood. And then Think about the idea of how wood is oftentimes used as a slang term for erection. He really turned her on. She liked his hair, his smile. And the assumption is that he's blonde. That's why she said yellow. But the other, Jack, notice how Jack gets a name, because they have some sort of an emotional relationship as opposed to the other one, which is just physical attraction. But the other Jack had a claim on her already, and she had to admit he did wear well. In fact, to be perfectly fair, he understood her. And his long lithe frame beside hers in the evening tenderly lay. Still, if the blonde guy dropped by someday, couldn't Way just lead on to Way? No. For if Way led on and Jack found out, she doubted he would ever come back. And in the first poem, we had established that one choice precludes another. You can't have everything. This poem is asking, is that really true? And at first she's contemplating, well, I can't have this other individual or else I'm going to lose what I already have, which is Jack. Oh, she turned with a sigh somewhere ages and ages hence. In other words, because this is a big decision. She might be somewhere ages and ages hence, she might be telling this, and I, she would say, stood faithfully by. But by then, who would know the difference? In other words, is this really such a huge decision in the context of the universe as a whole? With that in mind, she took the fast way home, the road by the pond, and phoned the blonde. And notice how the language seems to move more quickly as the idea that she took the fast way home. And even that could be somewhat ambiguous because we aren't necessarily sure what the fast way is. Is the fast or the easy way following convention blindly, the way that E.E. Cummings suggested people do, right to the point of death? Or is the fast way basically satisfying one's desires, even if they are in contrast with the societal expectations of the time? Though I can say that 1984 was a very different kind of time. It was known as the decade of greed, and I was a teenager in the 1980s, and the idea that one could perhaps have it all. And think about how this poem also upsets our expectations because we have a female who's contemplating two men. How would this poem be different if it was a man contemplating two females? Or perhaps a man contemplating two men, or perhaps a female contemplating two females. And look at the poem's title, The Lover Not Taken. So we don't know exactly what she said when she phoned the blonde. She could have said that no, they couldn't pursue their relationship, or she could have said yes, they could pursue their relationship. So if nothing else, I like this poem because it's an example of a parody. And again, while certainly you can analyze this poem as a standalone poem, you really need to talk about Frost, The Road Not Taken, in order to truly appreciate the depth of this poem. So that will do it for us today. So that next class we can finish up with our poetry unit and then basically move to the final exam. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on Tuesday and put closure onto our poetry unit. Take care. Bye-bye.